everyone. So today I'm going to cover how to heat emboss a stamped image. First, you need to gather supplies, and the things you're going to need are an embossing ink pad or a Versamark pad if you have it, some embossing powder. It comes in black, white, clear, and all sorts of colors. You'll need a heat gun. And no, a hairdryer will not work. It won't get hot enough, plus it will blow the powder everywhere. Another thing you'll need is a tidy tray. I almost forgot where I put it. A tidy tray to use to collect the powder in. If you don't have one of those, just take a piece of paper and fold it up, and that will work too. You'll see when I demonstrate what I mean by that. And then you're also going to need a rubber stamp and some type of cardstock or paper to stamp on. Optional items that you might like to have handy would include a non-stick craft sheet or a glass mat to protect the surface you're working on, an anti-static pad, and a small paintbrush. So you ready to heat emboss? Let's get started. Okay, so now that we've gathered all our supplies, let's heat emboss. So the first thing we're going to do is open the jar of embossing powder so we have it ready. If you have an anti-static pad, you can rub it onto the cardstock. This will help prevent the embossing powder from sticking places you don't want it to stick. Then with the embossing ink, you're going to ink up your rubber stamp and stamp it onto the cardstock. Next, place your cardstock over the tidy tray and sprinkle the embossing powder over it. Then you're going to tap off any excess. If you see any places where it didn't get the embossing powder on it very well, you can sprinkle over again and tap off. Next, I'm going to put all the powder back in the jar, and I like to set the embossing powder away from where I'm working so I don't get any heat on this and accidentally melt it. So if there were any stray little pieces of embossing powder, you can take a brush and just brush them off, but it looks good, so we're going to heat it, emboss it. First, I turn on my heat gun, let it warm up for a few seconds, and then I start heating up the stamped image. I usually use some type of tool like this paintbrush to hold down the cardstock so it doesn't go flying away. And also, you don't want to use your finger because it gets very, very hot. You'll know the part of the image is embossed when you start seeing that area not only raise up but also get shiny. So I'll try to hold this up to see if you can tell. So now that's all shiny and raised, and it just adds a lot of visual interest to whatever project you're working on. Now the next thing you could do if you're going to use this on a card or another project is you could color it in with markers or with watercolor paints, just about anything you want to, or you could leave it plain if you want to. So here's an example of a card. This butterfly was embossed. I don't know how well you can see it, but it was embossed with embossing powder and then colored in with Copic markers. The other thing that I like to do with either the clear or the white embossing powder is to make it work as a resist. So here's some examples. So I stamped this in clear, or stamped this with the embossing powder, or the stamp, excuse me, stamped, and then sprinkled it with clear embossing powder, and then inked over with Ranger Distress inks. So the embossed area will resist the ink, and it will leave this area white, or whatever the color of the background happens to be. So here's another example of one I did, again stamped with clear, then used distress ink over it, And here's another one This one happens to be white embossing powder. It doesn't really matter if you use the white or the clear, you're gonna get the same effect if you're just inking with Distress inks over. And I kind of want to show you how that works. So this I have already embossed in clear. And I'm just going to take a couple of different colors of the Distress ink using on my foam applicator and blending ink over it. I can never just use one color, or not very often anyway. So anyway, I could continue blending this through, and this stamped area is going to remain white, and it's going to be raised and a little bit shiny for some visual interest. Now, before we leave, I want you to know that the embossing powders can be used over any type of water-based ink, including dye inks and pigment inks, not just the embossing inks. However, when working with the dye inks, you're going to want to work really, really quickly because the dye inks are so fast drying. Some embossing inks come not only in clear, but in a tinted color like a gray or a blue. And the thing to be careful about that is if you're using a tinted pad and clear embossing powder, that tint, whether it's the gray or blue, will show through. So the tinted is nice to use because you can see exactly where you stamped a little bit better than using the clear, but you need to make sure not to use a clear embossing powder with the tinted. The other thing is, don't be afraid to mix and match colors if you want for your own custom colors. And for some special embossing effects, you can use a pen like this one from Ranger that has embossing ink in it. So you could draw lines or squiggles, or you could write something and then sprinkle it with the embossing powder and heat for another type of look. So those are some basic steps to heat emboss, and if it will help you, you can go to our website at scrappersedge.net and download this sheet for Heat Embossing Basic. It gives you the basic steps that we went over and also some tips when embossing. So I hope this is helpful, and I hope you have fun heat embossing.